We've not done this on the channel yet, but it's definitely something we're looking at doing more often, as you all know. We love talking about RPGs, war games, all of that good stuff, and we love learning and getting opinions from other people. So I am joined by Alan Sanchez-Capers. Is that right? You've got a long name.
Hyphenated last name.
Yeah, of Panopticon Gaming.
Yes.
And he is a fellow GM. He runs a lot of horror stuff like we're currently doing on the channel. He's running a spooky thing for the winter time, which we will get to talk about in a second and hopefully have a one-off on the channel of. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're about.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, my name's Alan Sanchez-Capers. I am the head GM for Panopticon Gaming Services. I do rent out my time as a GM. I also do a lot of horror writing as well as, mentoring for first-time game runners or people who are just trying to get into new systems that they've never really experienced. And I have a big passion for writing. I love being able to be as creative as I can possibly be while trying to make a cohesive narrative that I think everybody will enjoy all at the same time.
Yeah, that's awesome. See, like my least favorite part about GMing is probably actually doing, like I love thinking about stuff, but if I'm going to sit down and write something out that's detailed, I'm just going to see what happens and just put a bunch of random ideas on a piece of paper.
Sometimes I have that issue. Sometimes I actually feel like I have too many ideas, and so I have them written down, but I don't even get to use half of them half the time.
Yeah, and then about the other half the time, the players aren't going to do anything even remotely close to what you started with, and they're going to do their own thing, and they're going to be like, this is definitely what we were supposed to be doing, and it's not even close.
Yeah, and like I actually I got a quick thing about that actually. So in my regular D&D game, I have all these ideas written out. I have like 70 different paths that my players can take, and I ended up having a game where they took the one that I didn't expect. And so sometimes you just have to, accept that and watch for the changes and kind of just improvise as you go to see what happens. And sometimes it's a miss, and sometimes it's world changing, and it really does lead to better things.
Oh, absolutely. There's been so many moments like that in my campaign, like this campaign that I'm currently running on Twitch, which hey, actually some people have watched. We were after the first session. I was like positive about what everybody was going to do. I'm like, all right, they're going to go to one of these 3 towns, and they're going to do one of these 3 things because these are the ones that make sense. And then they went someplace completely different, and they did something I didn't expect them to do, and they joined a cult by accident, and it led to a lot of cool things, and now they're cult members. So hey, that's nice.
Yeah, you gotta love when they become cult members.
That's
the fun stuff.
Especially when one of the characters doesn't realize that they joined a cult, and everybody else is like, "It's definitely a cult," and he's like, "No,
it can't be.
It can't be a cult. Look at all these nice people talking to the Ice Devil."
Yeah.
So
I mean, yes, they may be adorning the castle with bodies, but who doesn't like a good hanging body?
Yeah, gotta love those super, super low insight checks. Yes, Cody, you are a cult member. I see you in the chat. So, yeah, all right. So, speaking of cults and Dungeons and Dragons and game systems, let's talk about the thing that I am most excited about because Halloween is on Saturday, and that is running horror.
Yes.
So, there is so much, like, I think horror, like the ability to tell a horror story is kind of an art when it comes to GMing because it's super easy to lose that, and it's super easy to not have scary elements in your story. Like if you've ever the D&D module Curse of Strahd, half the time it just becomes the players like kicking down the doors to the castle and going, "Hey Strahd, where's my money?" And there's no scary elements there.
I mean, in my experience, because horror has actually just been a recent genre to me. But in my experience, sometimes PvE, player versus environment,
Mm-hmm.
is a great way to do horror, but also the player versus themselves. Players become their own worst nightmares in the perfect situations if you can get them in there.
They absolutely can. And like just watching, sometimes like I was running a high level campaign for some of my friends, and some of the decisions that the characters made at high levels with these super dangerous items that they like, even if they were like well meaning at the time, but then just spiraling down this path that could lead to, killing your teammates with the power word kill spell by accident and
Yeah.
all of that stuff, and somebody getting incinerated, and those elements of horror, probably the scariest part in the past campaign that I've run so far, because they're still low level, was an avalanche and
Yeah.
the players having to deal with the environment. So what are some of the things that you like doing in your games for
Um,
horror? Do you have
well,
specific anecdotes?
so I've got in my current D&D game, it's less horror, but it's more of a, my players become their own worst enemies. I have a sorceress in my group that goes by the name Petra, and she has a flaw called arcane addiction. She is addicted to all things arcane. And so me being the nice guy that I am, I gave her the deck of many things.
Oh,
And then earlier, as I was talking to you about the Asimar that ended up joining the
mhm.
group, there was a sort of mashing between the Asimar and the deck of many things that ended up adding cards to the deck. It was the seven deadly sins. One card was gluttony. There's lust, and that player ended up drawing, or the Petra, the witch, the sorceress. I mean, had drawn. She had drawn all these cards that just made her continuously draw. I think she drew almost 14 cards in one day.
Wow, that
Yeah,
is
it
not
was
what you want.
no, it was definitely world breaking, and it got to the point where the rest of the party had to fight Petra in order to get the deck away from her.
Wow, that is actually, that's super super good. Yeah, like the deck of many things is one of those items I've always been scared to chuck into a campaign, because
it,
it's one
it,
of those things
I
where it's
mean,
like this could end tonight, or this could make the campaign go on for 6 months past the expected time.
oh yeah, and it kind of depends on what the setting is and the
Mhm.
tone. I actually built part of that section of the campaign around the deck of many things being
Mm.
involved. I knew the risks, and I knew that it was going to be a world-breaking event because that's what I planned for it to do.
Makes sense. Yeah, like when you toss a high level magic item in there, you got to expect that. Like I was running a high level campaign, and I chucked the wand of Orcus into the fray, and
I
that was
love that. I
that was a
love it.
blast. Yeah, so those are all great ideas for horror. What are some of the systems that you like using other than five dungeons? Well, first of all, what systems do you play? What are your go tos?
So I started originally on 3.5 for Dungeons and Dragons. I also played five. I recently just getting into 5e, but I've also played Chronicles of Darkness, which is actually my current favorite for horror.
Hmm.
I feel like it's a much more realistic setting for the horror genre, just because of the sanity system,
Hmm.
the D10 explosion stuff that gets kind of into the nitty gritty. And it's an easy system to learn as a player, but it's a little more nuanced as a DM.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and then another system that I actually really, really love is Mutants and Masterminds if you're into superheroes.
yeah. I've heard really good things. I've never gotten to play Mutants and Masterminds, but I've heard really really good things about
Oh,
it.
it's such a well done system that provides you with the tools that you need to create literally any power. All you're doing is putting points into what it does. Like if you wanted to be able to teleport, but you can only teleport so many feet because that's like your limit,
Hmm.
then you can set that. And it's all done on a point buy system. It's very after you get through your first couple of games, you really get the hang of it. The only weird side to it is that it doesn't have a health system.
Oh,
It's
okay.
done by conditions.
Mm, that is interesting.
And Yep, and then coming up in the next few months, I pre-ordered for Tiny Tina's Bunkers and Badasses.
Hmm.
I'm a big, big Borderlands fan, so I am like super hardcore going down and doing Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep.
Yeah, that sounds like it's going to be a blast. I'm also a big Borderlands fan. I've not gotten to play in a little while, but it is a fantastic game. Um,
I
yeah.
mean, I tried playing the mock-up that somebody did
Hmm.
on Deadlands for it, and it was fun, don't get me wrong, but this is directly from Gearbox and
Right.
Nerdvana. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how they get this together. And I ended up buying the deluxe edition, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the models, the battle maps,
Hmm.
everything.
Nice. Well, hopefully it's not like Wrath and Glory, where it got better when they outsourced it to a third party.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that first
I
system
mean,
was rough.
yeah, that was. I suspect with Gearbox though, they're going to probably try and keep it as close to the chest as they
Hmm.
possibly can, just because of how they're doing any sort of release stuff for the game now.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm excited to see what they do for that. I agree. They're like 5e in particular, and I've talked about this in my videos quite a bit. Is difficult to make scary because your PCs are so powerful. So we need to when I'm writing horror scenes, I try to do that with a lot of showing, not a lot of telling, and a lot of
Yeah,
letting the PCs figure stuff out. Because like a mind flayer, in theory, should be terrifying.
yeah,
But really,
yeah,
the mind flayers aren't terrifying. It's what the mind flayer is doing in the environment that's terrifying. Because you're just going to walk in there and kill it in a couple of minutes. That's not going to be that scary.
yeah. My with my experience, I've always learned that the more I can make somebody do roles that seem almost random,
Hmm.
are great ways to sort of like heighten the anxiety a bit. One of the things that I do for my Chronicles of Darkness game is I constantly make them roll perception checks when it doesn't seem like something's there.
Hmm.
Or these guys have actually gotten to the point now where they check every door before they open it because somebody didn't and ended up getting a shotgun straight to the chest.
Yeah, and I think
So
yeah, that's always a great point to have your PCs at when you get them to be like setting watch when there's nothing there, or
yeah,
checking for things when there's nothing there, or when you start rolling dice for absolutely for like nothing. You're just sitting there rolling dice, and they're like, "What's happening? What are you
yeah.
doing?"
My personal favorite thing to do, especially with fifth edition, is what's your passive
Passive
wisdom
perception.
again?
I do
Yeah,
that
what's
all the
passive perception?
time. Yeah, and I always do it to the characters that like have no passive, like the ones that are just like completely not observant.
Oh yeah,
Or it's even better when you do it to like a cleric with like a 20 for their passive, and they're like, okay, moving on, and they're like, wait, what? I see
yeah.
the wind.
I mean, I should see everything. No, no, don't worry about it. You're fine.
Yeah, no, that's always a great time. When actually, so we've talked about like setting up horror and all of that stuff. So I'm not super familiar with the other systems. I know I've recently refamiliarized myself with running combat in a different system like Call of Cthulhu. So
Yes.
how do you go about running combat when you're trying to keep things tense? Because sometimes combat can get away from either side. Usually me, but how do you go about
Yeah,
that?
and so with my experience in it is that I get a lot of flack for this sort of mentality, but and just change gears and leap the segue with me. But my mentality for it is that the players and the DM playing almost like two separate games.
Hmm.
Um, the players are playing an action RPG, while the DM is sort of playing a real time strategy game, and so you kind of have to flexible and in the moment, but you also have to be planning like 4 or 5 stages ahead, and you get to
Absolutely.
go and yeah, you really get to play this game like a game of chess,
Hmm.
or Stratego, something that is on a whole nother level, different than what you're normally comprised of. Yes, you have your dice rolls. Yes, they have their dice rolls. They get their defense, but really what it comes down to is, can you as a GM be fluid enough to let them get what they are trying to achieve while making the challenge hard? Something that makes, like, the one thing I tell my players is all the time, that death is a brilliant motivator to
Hmm.
living.
Yeah, and I don't know who's giving you flack for that because that's spot on the way I have run, every game since I was 13. That is
Yeah.
exactly that because that's what you got to do it because you're not a player, and when I do get to play, I appreciate it because it's an entirely different experience than managing this world. Because basically, I don't know if you've ever played diplomacy, but
Yep.
yeah, okay. So basically, being a DM is like playing a one-man game of diplomacy, where you're
Yeah.
managing all of you're doing the politics, you're doing what all the people are doing behind the scenes. You're managing the underground crime scenes, you're managing the armies, you're managing the gods, you're managing the shop owner on Third Street. Like you've got to
Yeah.
be prepared for all of that stuff, and you got to make sure that your PCs are, not necessarily heading in the right direction, but a direction that makes their story worth telling and listening to. And definitely struggles along the way, death, which I fear in Icewind Dale because it's a brutal campaign. Um,
Yeah.
Death, hardships, sadness within the PC's life. Like I always tell my players, think of it this way: I'm your parent in this world, and I want you to succeed, but I want you to really earn that success along the
Yeah.
way.
What I tell my players is that I'm not here to try and kill you. I'm just here to make the experience worthwhile.
Exactly. Like the DM's never going to try to kill somebody, but if somebody
Yeah.
dies, I mean that happens.
Yeah, if you die, if they die, they die.
Exactly.
But it's like, it's not my intent to try and openly kill you. It is my intent to make it challenging
Hmm.
so that you guys are always on your toes, that it's not just oh, hey, we're going to go to spot A, kill this guy, then
Hmm.
go to spot B. No, that just gets really boring and samey. I feel like if you go in and there is a challenge involved with trying to get to point A, and then you get to point A and it's a lot worse than you were expecting,
Hmm.
then it's
Hmm.
the game is a lot better.
Definitely. And yeah, keeping things interesting is something that I'm constantly trying to do, and like making combat interesting and different every time we approach it. Because you don't want it to just be a case of
Oh,
I whack this guy with my broadsword. Okay, next. Like this past session, I sent assassins from a rival spy ring that my players are aware that they've pissed off and then have just kind of ignored, to kill one of the player characters. And they dropped him, as assassins tend to do when they get the jump on somebody who didn't set a watch.
yeah.
And I figured it'd be okay because the bard would start healing, but the bard jumped into combat and didn't start healing, and then we were rolling death saves. So
Whoops.
yeah, that was a whole different experience than I had anticipated.
Yeah. I actually, one of the things that I did in my most recent session for my week or my
Mhm.
biweekly game is I started to change the mechanics of combat a little bit by taking from a different system. So instead of having everybody roll initiative, I kept having everybody roll listen checks.
Mm. Hmm. What system is
And
that from? Because I know it's a big thing in Call of Cthulhu.
I took a little bit from Call of Cthulhu. I
Hmm.
took a little bit from the Chronicles of Darkness,
Hmm.
New World of Darkness series. But the way I did it was they were fighting an orc that I called the War Master. So this guy is a strategist. He is all about utilizing his environment to his best of his ability while trying to maintain control of the battlefield. And so while the players were trying to hit him from afar, they couldn't really quite see what he was doing. And so they would have to listen for him because he would hide. And
Nice.
then he would come out of nowhere and strike hard, and then move out of the battlefield again.
This is
And
I'm
so,
stealing that idea 100%. Like,
yeah, go ahead, man.
yeah,
Feel free. I actually have the audio for that game too, because I record all of my sessions.
nice, nice. Yeah, because I'm prepping this. If my players are listening, listen or don't listen, but these are spoilers. I'm prepping this next part in Icewind Dale called the Caves of Hunger, and
Oh yeah.
one of my PCs like wrote a backstory, didn't know anything about the campaign, tied into vampires, and
Oh, nice.
he's been bitten by a vampire, and he's trying to get a cure for it before it's too late. And in the Caves of Hunger, there is a knoll vampire, and I've been trying to figure out how to make this fight interesting because it's a knoll vampire,
Yeah.
so it should be different than just a standard fight. So this is what we're doing.
It's going to be awesome. I definitely think that the sort of skirmish tactic
Mm-hmm.
is actually a great way to do combat. Instead of just outright rolling your initiative, you have everybody try to make this like, oh, where's it coming from sort of thing. Like, yeah, you have to have an order in which you attack,
Of
but
course.
you, the DM, get to decide who that target's going to be just by who's not paying attention the most.
Yeah, we over the summer I was running an Acquisitions Incorporated kind of crime style D&D campaign where people would just come in and out because it was easier to do that online over COVID. And
Yeah.
I had there be a spy, not a spy. What's I forget the name of it now. It's the generic rogue subclass that can use items as a bonus action.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, God, I can't even remember off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
but anyway, so I had there be whatever the name of that subclass is that I'm now blanking on, and I gave them a ring of invisibility that they could use as a bonus action
Nice.
during this big fight that's been happening. So there's like standard, they're fighting guards and stuff, but then every so often this invisible person out of nowhere comes up and stabs somebody, and then becomes
Yeah.
visible again. So yeah, that stuff is absolutely awesome. So while we're on the subject of combat and the DM playing a large scale strategy game, you also mentioned that you were a wargamer. You and I talked about this a
Yes.
bit before we got on. So let's talk about some additional parts to running the game. How, like, do you feel like wargaming informs your combat decisions at all? Do you feel that, like, do you prefer minis, maps? Like, what's your style when it comes to that stuff?
I it really kind of depends. Like if I'm face to face with my players, I like having maps. I
Mm-hmm.
love having the big drawn, things that I can build on. I like having the stationaries that, the players can climb up on. I love having models. But when, in this, technological age, you don't really get that sorry, you don't really get that physical aspect. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to work on getting the digital aspect going, but I do use a lot of the theater of the mind stuff. And so I have to be very descriptive with how the landscape is done.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from a 5 foot by 5 foot room all the way to a massive 10-mile battlefield. Um, and that sort of field description really helps me when I was playing Warhammer 40K,
Mm-hmm.
when I did some bolt action stuff. Being able to visualize a battlefield, seeing it for what it is, how troop movements will work, how troop placements for the future are going to come in. That sort of gameplay really does help you out as a GM, for 2 person to 200,000 person skirmishes. It just really depends on how you look at the battlefield.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that because there's so much like it's great to have that some kind of type of background. Like you can go online and you can play Age of Empires for
Oh yeah.
getting the same kind of idea. But definitely, I feel
And
like
actually,
wargaming
funny
is.
enough, Age of Empires was one of the first RTS games I started playing.
Mhm, me too. Yeah, and just what was the other one? It was I think it was the ancient Greek version, Age of Mythology or
Oh
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
Age of Mythology. Yeah, that
Yeah,
one was a lot of fun.
and that stuff is great to just like kind of get ideas because you can see and like if you especially like watching gameplay of that or like Total War and seeing like trick movements and seeing the way like other people are thinking about this stuff, playing games with other people, playing war games, tabletop games with other people, and seeing the way they do things, you can go, huh, I never thought about moving those guys that way. or using those
Yeah.
strategies. So yeah, always.
And then like taking it even a step further, you got games like Catan or
That's on the
Monopoly.
shelf behind me. Yep.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I saw that. When you get games like Catan and Monopoly, where it's all about resource management, then you're adding a whole nother level to your gameplay, and understanding how those games work really helps you with world building, because then you can understand how kingdoms interact, how
Yeah.
trade routes can be affected by something as measly as roadside thieves, or the mob trying to bust in on this bank that's owned by a different mob. You understand the sort of philosophies that go on in diplomacy, and they really help you build the world, set the stage, set your pieces, and give your players options for where they want to go, who they want to ally with, who they want to be the bad guy, kind of like what they did with Xanathar's Guide to Everything.
Yes. Yes. Xanathar's. I'm so excited for the second book, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything.
Oh
That's going to
yes.
be fantastic. Yeah. No, I'm glad we made this segue into talking about politics because in Dungeons and Dragons, because that was where I was going with all of this stuff. Even a game like Lords of Waterdeep, which I feel like a Lord of Waterdeep is a perfectly attainable thing in Dungeons and Dragons, and
Oh yeah.
lots of players are going to wind up going that way and understanding the politics of micromanaging like some of your personal men. What are your opponent's men doing? What are your political rivals men doing? What are your allies doing? A long
Yeah.
term goal of mine, which I'll definitely I'm going to reach out to some GMs along the way after we get through this campaign and build up a bit more of a following. Is a long term goal of mine was to always have like a game of diplomacy running, and the game of diplomacy is the world that my players are playing in. So we'd have like the faction turn and everything, kind of like I think what the channel Roleplay did with their game Far Verona, which was like a science fiction version of this.
Oh yeah, yeah, I heard about that
Yeah,
one.
so like like a fantasy version of it where there's like a faction turn, and the different factions work out what you're doing, and you would get like a printout from the other game masters for what they wanted their faction to do
Yeah.
for that month or week, and what they wanted their part of the world to be doing, and there'd be votes on all of that stuff, and then having your players deal with those actions in the real world.
Yeah.
Well, fantasy roleplay world, but yeah.
Yeah. But that's a perfect thing to do, because it makes the players have to focus on what sort of resources that they have available, what sort of resources the enemy's going to have, and it changes the course of gameplay.
Yeah, it absolutely does. When I was in high school, I used to go to one of the social studies teacher, and my players never knew this, but he was playing one of the bad guys in the campaign, and I'd be like, "All right, this is what they did this week. What do you want your what do you want your lord to do? What do you want your
Yeah.
troops to do?" And then I'd have them do that because it also adds like a realism element. Like when you're taking, it doesn't have to be from another person, but like when you're taking real examples of that stuff from
Yeah.
history or any of that and inserting it into
Well,
your game.
yeah, I mean, like earlier we were talking about my current game,
Mm-hmm.
where the two players that I had, Petra, where she basically,
Yes.
her and one of the other PCs ended up doing this weird thing where they went completely different direction. The PCs ended up doing something very completely
Mm-hmm.
different. I was expecting them to head into a smaller town, do a little more research, and then maybe try and head back after the invading forces came in and maybe clean up a little bit. Instead, um, one of them met an NPC that I wasn't expecting them to meet yet.
Mm-hmm.
They became embroiled in a history that they weren't technically going to know yet,
Mm-hmm.
because it was lost to them. And then when they found it, they became angry. They jumped in, went straight into the invading forces, called them out, called out everybody that was involved in this missing chunk of memory,
Mm-hmm.
and then just went to town on revenge. And this whole scenario, long story short, this whole scenario ended up changing Petra's sort of focal point from a chaotic nature to a conquesting nature. Um, Ended up shattering my preconceived notions, I guess, onto how my world was built. She now controlled a major city with a major cash vault with major items, and everything about this meant that war was imminent.
Mm.
She was leading now a 600,000 man army just because she controlled this one place.
Yeah, that is incredibly, that is awesome. Before I do want to have you talk, because we were talking about this before we got on, and I do want you to talk about your game in just 1 second. But I want to touch on one point that you made there, and that's leaving kind of a real world element to your campaign that I like to
Mm.
have in there, where I don't force things upon my players. Like
Oh yeah,
if there was going to be these things that are going on that I have planned out that the PCs stumble on before those things came to fruition, I don't change those things. I leave them because it lets the PCs feel like they made an impact. Like if they go to the wrong part of the woods, I don't move the
yeah,
cabin from the other part of the woods and put it where they are because they decided to do something different. And the same, I try to keep the same principle that I'm not going to, change something that NPCs are doing just because the characters happen to stumble across it at that point in time.
yeah, and like there's that argument of railroading versus
Mm-hmm.
sandboxing. You have to find that happy medium between the two. Like railroading somebody, yeah, you get the story there eventually, but sandboxing sometimes it becomes overwhelming. So you have to let them choose where to go, but once they choose, you have to kind of just gently guide them, let them figure it out on their own.
Exactly, like in Icewind Dale. That's the only game I've been playing recently, so that's what I keep coming back to. But in Icewind Dale,
Yeah.
my players, and one of the players called this right off the bat. They released a possessed character into the world,
Uh,
and then they
yeah.
left. Then they left the town. They just left, and now there's this ghost running around, messing things up for people. And I kind of expected them to come back, and I'm just letting things play out in that town as it does. And then
Yeah.
when they circle back to it, it's going to be what it is, and they get
Yeah,
to put
and
that
I
together.
do. I'm doing a similar thing with my Chronicles of Darkness game. I actually just recently had one of my players ended up having to leave midway through a
Mm-hmm.
game due to some other
Yeah, yeah,
scheduling
real life
conflicts.
stuff.
Yeah, yeah, real life stuff, and you can't really judge on that. You
Yeah, of course, it
can't
is what
really
it
say,
is.
oh, yeah. And so what I did was they're facing an opponent that has the ability to shape reality, so that what they call as a reality bender is literally just removed him from the scene, and he went on his own exploration, and I explained it to that character, that this is what happened, here's the things that happened, and when he came to, he realized that everything that happened up to that point was literally to get him to that point. Earlier on in the game, he found a dying version of himself and almost had a psychotic breakdown because of it. And then when he got to that point where he was removed from reality and brought back in, he realized, oh, that's actually him that was sitting there dying.
That is incredibly cool. Just because we're about halfway through and we have 7 viewers, I'm just going to go ahead and tell everybody out there once again. We are here with Alan from Panopticon Gaming. He's a fellow GM, and he has a lot of cool ideas, and I'm super super glad that him and I are working on some stuff, doing this type of stuff together. So now that we've reached the halfway point, we have 7 viewers, and we've touched on some of your games already. Why don't you go ahead and start by telling us about your current D&D game?
So my current D&D game is a 3.5 setting, very much homebrewed. I wish I had scanned my map. I would have sent it. I did a full-size world map, not just like a country
Mm-hmm.
map, with kingdom borders, allied everything. I've got trade routes. I've got power vacuums. I've got struggles. There's an invading force of orcs coming through from an extra dimensional place. And on both sides of this campaign, I've done it epic style. My party is just one group of players. Those players have played through half of the villain story, and now they're playing through the hero side, getting to see what sort of the consequences of those actions, and they're understanding that as they're trying to come up on something, they're not able to do it because of the fact that it's been blocked off to them. They're not the villains anymore. They're the heroes. Those actions are no longer allowed because the villains control that.
That is incredible. Like I love that idea. So actually, as someone who's currently in the process of writing a script for a video on how to run an evil campaign, why don't you go ahead and tell me how you went about that? Like, what was your session zero process? What did you and the players talk about? What was your GM prep like for that? And then I'll steal all the ideas and credit you at the end of the video.
Yeah. So originally I had the idea of running it with two groups, and that was the initial plan, was to run it with two groups. And then that second group fell out. But I started out with a session zero, just like everybody should. You get your character set up, you get everybody to one location. And this one for me was having all of my players follow the sounds of a war drum that was coming to them in their dreams, drawing them to one central location. And then the other one that I had for my heroes is that they were all being summoned by some sort of like a druidic council, that there's this thing going on at a temple that should not be there because it has never existed. And it takes them along those coinciding lines that eventually get them to the point where they meet in the middle and start down this epic conquest.
Okay, that is very cool. When your players were playing evil characters, and I'm assuming this went relatively well. How did you get them to not be chaotic stupid in running that stuff?
So initially I let them be as chaotic stupid as I wanted them to be. And they found out the hard way that sometimes that doesn't work because you get caught real quick. I don't mean to bag on some of the players, but there was a character that wanted to play an aquatic elf, and the setting started in a desert.
Oh, God.
So eventually she changed over to a different character.
Yeah, I'm sure she did.
But like one of my wife's character, who I love for the villains,
Everybody does.
The character's name is Cupcake.
Okay.
She is a half-orc barbarian that has a childlike mind. And she is sweet as pie, but her tantrums go on to full-on rage.
Yeah,
because she's a barbarian.
Never trust somebody named Cupcake. That is a recipe for disaster.
And so, I let them be chaotic stupid until a point where they... Oh, honey, he is drooling.
Oh,
Dog problems?
Dog problems. Sorry, guys. But I let them be as chaotic stupid as they wanted to be. And when they realized that, you can't really murder hobo your way into something, it was easier for, the sorceress. She's a mind bender. So she would just use her manipulation control powers to be able to get what she needed. If that didn't work, they would intimidate to get what they needed. And eventually it worked until they had to fight. And then they would fight as hard as they could until it nearly killed them or they won.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think sometimes players assume that as DMs, we get to be chaotic stupid with our bad guys. But if we're chaotic stupid with our bad guys, first of all, you're going to find them and then you're going to kill them. And second of all, it's not going to be fun or realistic for anybody.
No, you really have to be, you got to be liberal with your menacing, I suppose.
Yes.
And that's the one thing that I gave the BBEG in my game, is that he is menacing. He's not just a tactical general. He is also a very capable fighter, and he the tribe that I've created for them, it's very much, we work towards the being of the tribe. Everything we do is for the tribe, and so we don't ever I lost the word for it. God, I lost the word.
Yeah, they don't stray
Yeah.
from what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, they don't stray away from the needs of the tribe. It's death before dishonor.
Yeah, yeah, that's great because like in my current campaign, I have plans. The module ends at level 12, but I have plans for far past level 12,
Yeah.
and the BBEG of my campaign has never even been mentioned. I don't think if you could ask one of my players right now who the BBEG, who's actually pulling the strings, is, I can almost guarantee none of them would be able to tell you who it was, because the one connection in the whole hundreds of miles that they're in, they have consistently walked by and never given a second thought to it.
Oh
And
yeah.
just setting stuff up like that in the long term, but where the bad guys are being smart about how they're doing it. So, and there's these long thought out connections where like there's an actual plot, and we're not just throwing things out there into the world. So I want to get my players playing an evil campaign at some point, just so they can see what it's like
And
to be on that side
and
of it.
one thing that I will say is that has been very helpful is that if you I give each and every one of my players a little bit more information than the others, and I do it on a personal basis so that they have that information but everybody else does not. And like with Petra has more information regarding her future than the other players, so she knows that that's her goal. And it's not like I'm saying, "Oh, this is what you're trying to obtain." It's that you're trying to go for this. So sort of kind of align your actions with that, and if you get there, you get there. If not, you tried.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
but it does help because I have all these intersecting little side stories that start going and meshing together that is actually getting into everybody's way, and it's creating a dramatic tension that everybody in my group loves.
That's really cool. So we've talked a good deal about D&D, and obviously has overlap into other role playing games, as other role playing games have overlap into D&D. So why don't you go ahead and talk about the other system that you're running? Like, give us a brief overview
Yeah.
of the system and then the campaign.
Yeah, so I'm running Chronicles of Darkness. It is off of World of Darkness for anybody who's familiar. It's a D10 system. Everything is done by dots, I suppose. Dots are the number of dice you get to roll. Eights, nines, and tens are considered successes. Tens explode, which means you get to keep that success, roll it back in for additionals. And I've ran quite a few games of Chronicles of Darkness. Starting with an SCP based game, which I have to thank my wife for getting me so heavily into SCP.
Welcome.
Yeah, so I'm running an SCP exploration game into a facility that I've called the Glass House, where any damage you do to the house happens to you.
Ah,
Yeah. My current exploration team is the Epsilon 4 team, the Rust Walkers. These guys are currently deep in it. They are 4 sessions in, which is longer than my Alpha team went in. My Alpha team only got 2 sessions.
wow.
And yeah, these guys, I've modified a little bit of the mechanics of the game to be able to make it a little more sanity based, where like they've got an integrity system where it's like where you sit on morality. I've changed it so it's your sanity. And so as my players hit these situations that should be mentally and morally taxing, their sanity starts slowly rotting away. And so far, I've actually had 2 or 3 TPKs that resulted in them being brought back into different versions of themselves from other timelines. And as that happens, their sanity is permanently reduced. And so the more it becomes reduced,
really cool.
the more it becomes reduced, the more permanent the sanity becomes until there's no more sanity left. Then your character becomes mine.
Nice.
And so, yeah, my players really they got to the point where it's oh, I'm not just going to check the door. It's I'm checking the door hinge, the door frame, everything about this door before we enter, just to make sure that nothing's on the other side. And sure enough, they check it, and there is something on the other side. So they lob a grenade in there to get rid of it before they go in.
Yeah, and like we were saying earlier, that's always the point. I don't know if we were saying that on stream or off stream, but you always want to get your PCs to the point where they're anticipating something like nothing bad could be happening, but if you get them to the point where they're like always prepared for that and they're always wanting to be one step ahead of the bad stuff that's happening, and then they start to, because then at that point like they start looking at it like a real world with real threats, with real repercussions, with real consequences for their bad choices, and that's always the point that I'm like striving to get to as a GM.
And the other thing that I know a lot of DMs and GMs hate is this idea of splitting the party. Sometimes splitting the party is the best idea for a GM to be able to add to that tension, because yes, you got to pay attention a little more to what the characters are doing and where they're going, what they're interacting with, but on their own, sometimes they have no choice to be able to deal with that threat ahead of them. There could be like a horde of zombies and it's one person. There's no way they're going to be able to handle that by themselves.
Absolutely.
Sometimes.
I never feel bad for the GM. I feel bad for the players when they split the party, because a split party is a weaker party, right? Fundamentally speaking, unless I've played in some campaigns where there's one kind of dominant OP character who could probably take on an entire army by themselves. I'm talking about, of course, my brother's barbarian, who has been multi-classed into like 6 different things at this point, and is level 16. But when the party is split, especially when it's split for a good reason, like that is an opportunity as a dungeon master to tell a different type of story.
And for me, I aim, especially with horror setting, my aim is to try and get them to either actively split on their own or get them to accidentally split due to the environment. They go, oh, look, there's an item over here. I'm going to check this out. Next thing they know, there's a trap door that they didn't check for.
I'm waiting for the day in Icewind Dale in a blizzard where people keep walking. Like, that's the day. I have so much for that day, guys. Whenever you get to that day, I know it's coming. You don't have that great decision-making skills. So when we get to that day, it's going to be a ton of fun.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, cool. We've talked about a lot of GM stuff in the 13-ish minutes we have left in what's been a very fun and informative chat. Let's talk about some overall GM tips that maybe less, of the politics, combat, running the game on a macro level. Like, what do you do on a micro level? What type of role-playing do you prefer and expect at your tables? And, like, what are the general things you do as a dungeon master?
Yeah. So I actually like my players to bring their own style of role playing. I've had quiet players. I've had very ruckus players. I've had players who are very tactical in their natures, and I've had players where they just want to be there to do the thing. And I let them create their own story. All I'm doing is letting them create their own story along another story. And so hold on. Yeah, so my wife brought this up. Adventure Sense, if you're familiar with them.
I am not.
It's another great. So they're like these gel crystals that are filled with a scent of a specific kind. This one is called the Alchemist Lab, and it does smell like what you would expect from an alchemist lab.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So you crack one open, you waft it a little bit, and you get that feel of being inside with, the little burners, perfumes being brewed, old tobacco sitting there in a pipe, old books. Yeah. And that's one way to kind of get, your players in the mood. The other thing that I like, sometimes our groups will actually, like, some of our players will bring bread. We make bread.
There's a cookbook
and we'll
coming out.
Oh yeah, the D&D, the Great Feast.
Yeah, I was reading through it today. It's really cool.
Yeah, I really wish I got on the pre-order of that. It looks cool.
Yeah, I'm getting actually. We just got off topic because that's easy to do. But I'm getting one of my friends to run a cooking show, a cooking segment for the YouTube channel,
Sweet.
cooking D&D
That's
stuff.
awesome.
Yes, but anyway, back to the Alchemist Lab and role playing.
Yeah, so I mean, having stuff like Game Sense, or
Mhm.
at some point we're planning on doing like a charcuterie board of various foods from from races in the game, or like I said about my players bringing their own style to the game for role playing, is I don't really like to hold everybody to a specific
Mhm.
standard, because it means everybody has to fit into that standard. And what I want for them is to have fun overall. It's not about trying to get to this end game. It's about the
Mhm.
players and their fun. When they have fun, I have fun. It means that I succeeded as a DM. Sometimes the story gets a little lacking because I'm more involved with their current little scene
Mhm.
rather than the overall story. And so we kind of slow down a little bit, but then
Yeah,
sometimes we pound through a lot more notes than I was expecting.
there are. Yeah, absolutely, and that's like the great part about running a game with people, especially people that you're like comfortable with, that you've done this
Oh yeah.
for a while. Because like in the last session of a game that I played, they went to the market and they bought birds and dogs, and they went pet shopping, and they spent maybe 20 minutes going back and forth on naming the animals, and at some point,
Yeah.
and because like one of the players has over the course of the campaign been like less comfortable like speaking in character, which I don't particularly mind. Like if you're not the type of guy that wants to speak in character, hey, that's not for you. That's absolutely fine. But then when we
Yeah.
got to the dogs, that's when the gloves came off and they were like, okay, this is what we're doing now because there's dogs involved.
Yeah, and sometimes you need that breakout moment. And like I've had shy players where they just don't until they find that moment. And when that moment hits, it's beautiful
Hmm.
because they really then let go and let it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the type of like surface level role playing that I think a lot of people think that stuff is about. And then there's like
Yeah.
kind of like the second level of role playing when people are like, okay, I've got this figured out now. I'm going to do what my character would do at all times. Like my character is this person. They are inflexible. This is always what we do.
Yeah.
And then there's that third level of role playing that I feel some people take a long time to get to, some people never get there. But there are some people who have become very comfortable with the idea of stepping into somebody else's shoes and
Yeah.
filling, like actually taking on this role. Yes, this is what my character does, but my character is a person with these feelings, and they're complex and they change over time, just like they would for anybody else. And nothing is set in stone. Nothing has to be the same way all the time. And you don't even need to talk in character to get that across. But just, I feel like a lot of players would enjoy that aspect of the game more if they just
Oh yeah.
became open and vulnerable to that idea of that's the way things can play out and is perfectly fine.
Yeah, I feel like if you ditch the mechanics of character
Mm-hmm.
creation in any sense of the game, you put a little bit of yourself into every one of your characters,
Mm-hmm.
and that I feel like it really brings your character to life. You look at a character sheet and it's just a bunch of numbers, but when you create a character yourself and you put yourself into its creation, you really give it power. It makes it you have the good times and you feel it viscerally, and when you lose your character you feel it viscerally too, because that's a part of yourself that was a part of that game.
Yeah, absolutely. Like speaking of losing characters, if your character dies, because it happens. Like I've had
Yeah.
plenty of characters die. It happens. But if your character dies and you can feel the mood in the room drop, and you can feel people like you can like they don't need to cry, they don't need to visibly be upset, but you can feel that atmosphere in the room, you can feel that mood. I feel like that is like the epitome of having a good character over the course of the
Oh
campaign,
yeah.
that when
Yeah.
that character is no longer there, everybody feels it.
Yeah, and that happened with me when I actually helped my wife with her GMing
Hmm.
debut. It was her first ever game she's ever ran, and I was playing a gunslinger, and my gunslinger ended up accidentally getting killed at the end,
Hmm.
and so you know. I felt terrible that my character got killed, but I was excited that it's been a while since I've
Right.
had a character death, and it was exhilarating.
It absolutely is. And, there have been moments in campaigns where characters have died, and it was like, okay, moving on. But
Yeah,
I feel like, especially for players out there, like, let yourself experience that moment. Just don't be like, if I die, I die. If you die, you do die, and you roll up a new character, and you come back the next session, and that's what it is. But if like experience that, let that be a thing that
yeah.
happens in the campaign, and explore it like you would anything else in an RPG, because that's what these games are here for.
Yeah, and like even from novice players to the more advanced, experienced veterans of the game, I always feel like putting just a little bit of yourself into your characters really
Yes.
changes how you look at your character, how they do their actions, and how things interact.
Yeah, I'm curious to get your thoughts on backstory here in a second. And like, I don't expect like everybody, like some of my players, they connect to the game by writing me 15 pages on what has happened in their farmer's life up until level
Yeah,
one. And if that's the way they connect to the game, I think that's fantastic. I expect a little bit of something for everybody, but especially when I can see, like my friend Nate right now is playing this Goliath, and I absolutely adore Nate. Nate's been like one of my best friends since eighth, ninth grade of school, and he's playing this Goliath, and I think he's doing a fantastic job playing this character because like Nate, he's a little socially awkward, but he's a caring guy. He looks out for
yeah,
his friends, and he's interested in his own way, making where they are a better place.
yeah. I actually for a one shot that one of my players ran, I created a character that was a little bit outside of the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And I just went with, you know what? I'm going to base them on me. I want to be as lazy as possible and do the least amount of work while getting the most amount of success. And I don't mean in like a min-maxing sense,
Right.
but I played a wild mage sorcerer with the con artist background,
Okay.
and his whole thing was he would dress as a priest and make things happen with prestidigitation, and then he would come in and exercise the place and make bank.
That is incredibly, and I love seeing stuff because that's just so cool. Like
Yeah,
that's not your typical
it's
sorcerer. That's awesome.
yeah, it's like I'm not a sneaky rogue who's gonna try and con you out of your
Mm-hmm.
money. I'm literally just a guy who can do magic that goes, hey, look, I am a priest. No, now I'm a fancy man. Oh no, now I'm just this like old guy.
Yeah,
I put a lot
that's
of points into disguise and
I'm
stuff
sure.
like that. Just built my character to be all around lazy.
That's awesome. Yeah, and like I love playing. I don't. That's not necessarily playing against stereotype as much as it is making your own entire category of character to fit into.
Yeah,
But like Hexblade Warlock is my favorite class to play in the game. And whenever I get a chance to play, the first Hexblade I made, typical Hexblade, super broody, super
yeah,
edgy, and that's
edge
where
lord all the
exactly that's where I
time.
was at in that point in my life, and that was whatever. Second Hexblade I made was this rich kid, super happy, into having a good time, and he just happened to have a demonic sword, and that was
Yeah.
just par for the course.
I had a character once. I mean, we've all had those edge lords.
Yes, absolutely.
My one of my first characters was an edge lord rogue, but I ended up creating what ended up becoming part of the background for my current campaign,
Hmm.
which was a storm singer bard.
Nice.
And basically he was just a bard who ran around and grifted people, ended up becoming a legend throughout the games that I played with him, and he really became something special to me. So when he died, like officially in my
Hmm.
games, it was
I'm
heartbreaking, but it
sure.
spawned
Yeah.
something brand new for me.
And that I think if there's anything that anybody can get out of this, like that's the point you want to get, where you can make such an impactful character and tell such a
Yeah,
great story as both a GM and a player, that it leaves an impact on everybody involved. So we are actually approaching the end of our time here. This has been awesome. Do you have any
Yeah.
closing things, like where can people find you? What do you want?
Yeah.
And one thing for them to take away from this from you.
Facebook page. Yeah. So I do have a Facebook page. It's Panopticon Game Master Services. You can find me there. You can also find me on startplaying.games as a GM for hire. I do have a set of games coming up this winter. The theme is Silent Nightmare, is what I've called it. So it's an investigation into this small town area during Christmas, obviously. But I also have a few other games coming out soon. So, please like and subscribe, follow me. You can find me also through Monsters and Munchkins. I love these guys. These guys are awesome. I thank you again for having me on.
Oh, of course. Like this. I was very much looking forward to having somebody else on who's into the idea of running spooky games and looking at RPGs from a slightly different perspective. Speaking of which, this Friday on this channel, we will be running Call of Cthulhu, and anybody that shows up and enters the code word into the chat, which will be shared repeatedly, will have a chance to win a copy of Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. Alan, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody out there, I hope that you've learned something from this, and until we meet again, don't forget to have fun and roll some dice.